Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other customers at Murphy's Diner. While most people came in wearing business suits or casual clothes, she walked through the doors every Tuesday morning with her military-style boots, faded jeans, and a simple black t-shirt that revealed intricate tattoos covering both her arms. The artwork told stories that most people couldn't understand, but Sarah carried them with quiet pride. The diner sat on the corner of Main Street in the small town of Millfield, where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was the kind of place where coffee refills were free, the pie was homemade, and gossip traveled faster than the morning newspaper. Sarah had been coming here for 3 months now, ever since she moved to town, and she always sat at the same booth in the back corner where she could see the entire restaurant. On this particular Tuesday morning, the autumn air was crisp, and the leaves were beginning to change colors. Sarah pushed through the glass door, causing the small bell above it to chime softly. She nodded politely to Martha, the waitress who had been working at Murphy's for over 20 years, and made her way to her usual spot. The breakfast crowd was busier than usual today. Local business owners discussed their plans over steaming cups of coffee, while elderly couples shared newspapers and complained about the weather. Sarah settled into her booth and picked up the laminated menu, though she already knew what she wanted. She always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee. At the table directly across from her sat the Hendersons, a middle-aged couple who owned the town's only insurance agency. Mrs. Henderson was a woman who believed that her opinion mattered more than anyone else's, and she never hesitated to share her thoughts about the people around her. Her husband, Robert, usually just nodded along while reading his phone, avoiding any confrontation. "I just don't understand why someone would do that to themselves," Mrs. Henderson said loudly, not bothering to lower her voice. She was staring directly at Sarah's arms, making no attempt to hide her disapproval. "All those tattoos make her look like she belongs in a prison, not a respectable establishment like this." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her eyes focused on the menu. She had heard comments like this before in different towns and different diners. People always had opinions about her appearance, and they rarely kept those opinions to themselves. "Maybe she was in a gang or something," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice growing louder with each word. "I heard that people in gangs get tattoos to mark their territory or show how many people they've hurt. It's disgusting if you ask me." Robert Henderson looked up from his phone for a moment, glancing nervously at Sarah. "Maybe you should keep your voice down, honey," he whispered to his wife. "I will not keep my voice down," Mrs. Henderson snapped back. "This is a family restaurant, and people like that shouldn't be allowed to sit here and make decent folks uncomfortable. Look at her arms. She's covered in those horrible markings. What kind of person does that to their body?" Other customers began to notice the commotion. Some turned in their seats to get a better look at Sarah, while others whispered among themselves. The atmosphere in the diner shifted from comfortable and friendly to tense and judgmental. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her, examining every detail of her tattoos and making their own assumptions about who she was and what she had done. Martha, the waitress, approached Sarah's table with a pot of coffee and an apologetic expression. She had witnessed this scene before with other customers, but never quite this loudly or aggressively. "I'm sorry about that, honey," she whispered as she poured Sarah's coffee. "Some people just don't know when to mind their own business." Sarah managed a small smile and nodded her thanks. "It's okay," she said quietly. "I'm used to it." But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. She stood up from her table and walked over to where the diner's manager, Tom Murphy, was standing behind the counter. Tom was the grandson of the original owner, a quiet man in his 50s who preferred to stay out of conflicts whenever possible. "Tom, I need to speak with you," Mrs. Henderson announced, her voice carrying across the entire restaurant. "I've been coming to this diner for 15 years, and I've never been so uncomfortable in my life. That woman over there is completely inappropriate for a family establishment." Tom looked over at Sarah, who was now staring down at her coffee cup, trying to become invisible. He had noticed her tattoos before, but she had always been polite and quiet, never causing any trouble. In fact, she was one of his better customers, always leaving a generous tip and treating the staff with respect. "What exactly is the problem, Mrs. Henderson?" Tom asked, though he already knew where this conversation was heading. "The problem is that she's covered in gang tattoos," Mrs. Henderson exclaimed, pointing directly at Sarah. "She probably sells drugs or beats people up for money. I don't feel safe eating in the same room as someone like that, and I'm sure other customers feel the same way." Several other patrons nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable with the confrontation. Sarah felt her face growing hot with embarrassment and anger, but she remained seated and silent. She had learned long ago that defending herself in situations like this usually made things worse. "Look at her arms," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice becoming more shrill with each word. "Those aren't normal tattoos. Those are prison tattoos, gang markings. She probably hurt innocent people to get those. I demand that you ask her to leave immediately, or I'm calling the police." The entire diner had gone quiet now, with every conversation stopped and every eye focused on the confrontation. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. She considered standing up and walking out, which would probably end the scene and allow everyone to return to their normal breakfast routine. But something inside her refused to run away. She had every right to be here, just like everyone else. She had done nothing wrong except exist in a way that made some people uncomfortable. Her tattoos weren't gang markings or prison art. They were memorials, honors, and reminders of sacrifices that most of these people could never understand. Tom Murphy found himself in a difficult position. Mrs. Henderson was a longtime customer who brought her family and friends to the diner regularly. But Sarah hadn't done anything to warrant being asked to leave. She was clean, polite, and paid her bills. He couldn't legally or morally ask someone to leave just because other customers didn't like their appearance. "Mrs. Henderson," Tom began carefully, "I understand your concerns, but that young lady hasn't done anything wrong. She's been coming here for months, and she's always been respectful and quiet. I can't ask someone to leave just because of their tattoos." Mrs. Henderson's face turned red with anger. "Then you're going to lose a lot of customers," she threatened. "I'll make sure everyone in this town knows that Murphy's Diner welcomes criminals and gang members. We'll see how long you stay in business when decent people stop coming here." The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Sarah could see other customers whispering and pointing, some nodding in agreement with Mrs. Henderson, others looking sympathetic but unwilling to speak up. She realized that no matter what happened next, she would probably never feel comfortable coming back to this place. Just as Mrs. Henderson was about to continue her tirade, the bell above the door chimed again. A tall man in his late 40s walked into the diner, wearing a crisp navy uniform decorated with ribbons and insignia that indicated high rank and extensive service. His presence immediately commanded attention, and conversations around the room began to quiet down. The man had silver hair cut in a precise military style, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to leadership and respect. His uniform indicated that he was a Navy SEAL commander, one of the most elite and respected positions in the entire military. He scanned the room briefly, taking in the tense atmosphere and the obvious confrontation that was taking place. Mrs. Henderson, seeing an opportunity to gain support for her position, approached the uniformed man. "Excuse me, officer," she said, assuming that a military man would surely agree with her position. "I'm having a problem with that woman over there. She's covered in what appear to be gang tattoos, and I don't feel safe having her in this family restaurant. Could you please speak with the manager about having her removed?" The commander looked in the direction Mrs. Henderson was pointing, and his eyes fell on Sarah. For a moment, he studied her tattoos carefully, his expression unreadable. Sarah braced herself for another judgment, another person who would assume the worst about her based on her appearance. Then, something unexpected happened. The commander's expression changed completely. His eyes widened slightly, and his mouth opened in what appeared to be recognition or surprise. He walked slowly across the diner towards Sarah's table, his boots clicking against the worn linoleum floor. Every person in the restaurant watched in silence as the decorated military officer approached the woman they had been ridiculing and judging. Sarah looked up at him nervously, unsure of what was about to happen. She had dealt with military personnel before, and their reactions to her were usually mixed. The commander stopped directly in front of Sarah's table and looked down at her tattoos with intense focus. He seemed to be reading them, studying each image and symbol with the expertise of someone who understood their meaning. His face showed a mixture of emotions that were difficult to interpret. Then, without warning, he did something that shocked everyone in the diner. The commander straightened his posture, brought his heels together, and raised his right hand in a perfect military salute. He held the position with absolute precision, his eyes focused on Sarah with unmistakable respect and admiration. The silence in the diner became deafening. Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open in confusion and disbelief. Other customers stared in amazement, unable to understand why this high-ranking military officer was saluting the woman they had been condemning just moments before. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the gesture and understood its meaning. Slowly, she stood up from her booth and returned the salute with equal precision, her own military training evident in the crisp movement of her arm and the straightness of her posture. The two held their salutes for several long seconds, a moment of mutual respect and recognition that transcended anything the other customers could comprehend. When they finally lowered their hands, the commander spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the silent restaurant. "It's an honor to meet you," he said simply, his voice filled with genuine respect. The silence that followed the salute seemed to stretch on forever. Mrs. Henderson stood frozen in place, her mouth still open in shock and confusion. She had expected the military officer to support her position, not honor the woman she had been trying to have removed from the restaurant. The other customers remained equally stunned, their breakfast growing cold as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. Commander James Mitchell looked around the diner, taking in the faces of everyone who had been participating in or witnessing the confrontation. His expression was calm, but serious, the kind of look that had commanded respect on battlefields around the world. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here," he began, his eyes moving from person to person around the room. "I heard someone suggest that this young woman's tattoos indicate gang membership or criminal activity. I'm here to tell you that nothing could be further from the truth." Sarah remained standing beside her booth, still overwhelmed by the unexpected show of respect from a fellow service member. She had grown accustomed to explaining her tattoos to curious civilians, but having a SEAL commander recognize their significance without explanation was something she had never experienced. Commander Mitchell gestured towards Sarah's left arm, where a complex tattoo depicted an eagle clutching a trident, anchor, and flintlock pistol. "This," he said, pointing to the design, "is the Navy SEAL trident. It's one of the most difficult military insignias to earn in the entire world. Only a few thousand people alive today have the right to wear this symbol, and fewer still have earned the right to have it tattooed on their body." The customers in the diner began to murmur among themselves, confusion evident in their voices. Mrs. Henderson looked back and forth between the commander and Sarah, struggling to understand how her assumptions could have been so wrong. "But she's a woman," Mrs. Henderson said weakly. "Women can't be Navy SEALs." Commander Mitchell nodded. "You're correct that women weren't traditionally allowed in SEAL teams," he replied. "But this young woman didn't serve as a SEAL. However, her tattoos tell me she served alongside us in some of the most dangerous missions our military has ever undertaken. She earned the right to wear these symbols through sacrifice and valor that most of us can't even imagine." He pointed to another tattoo on Sarah's right arm, this one showing a detailed military medical cross surrounded by names and dates. This indicates she was a combat medic, and those names represent soldiers whose lives she saved under fire. Each date marks a mission where she risked her own life to bring wounded warriors home safely. Sarah wiped her eyes, tried to maintain her composure as the commander continued to explain the meaning behind her body art. She had never expected a stranger to understand the stories her tattoos told, much less defend their significance to a room full of judgmental civilians. The tattoo on her shoulder, Commander Mitchell continued, pointing to an American flag with a black border, is a memorial for fallen comrades. The dog tags tattooed below, it belonged to soldiers who didn't make it home, men and women who died in her arms despite her best efforts to save them. She carries their memory with her every day, ensuring they're never forgotten. Tom Murphy, the diner manager, stepped forward with a new understanding and respect in his eyes. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "Sarah, I'm so sorry about what happened here today. You'll never pay for another meal in this restaurant as long as I'm running it." Mrs. Henderson looked around the room, realizing that public opinion had shifted dramatically against her. The other customers were no longer nodding in agreement with her complaints. Instead, they were looking at her with disapproval and embarrassment. She had attacked a decorated veteran based on nothing but ignorance and prejudice. I didn't know," Mrs. Henderson stammered. She never said anything about being in military. "She shouldn't have to," Commander Mitchell replied firmly. "Military service members shouldn't be required to prove their worth to anyone, especially not to justify their right to eat breakfast in peace. What happened here today was disgraceful." Sarah finally found her voice. "Thank you, sir," she said to the commander. "But I'm used to dealing with situations like this. People see the tattoos and make assumptions. It's not uncommon." Commander Mitchell's expression grew even more serious. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "You served 3 tours in Afghanistan, saved countless lives, and earned decorations for valor under fire. You should be honored wherever you go, not ridiculed by people who've never sacrificed anything for their country." The room fell silent again as people absorbed this information. Sarah had served 3 combat tours, something that many career soldiers never experienced even once. She had voluntarily put herself in harm's way repeatedly to serve her country and protect her fellow soldiers. Martha, the waitress, approached Sarah's table with tears in her eyes. "Honey, I am so sorry," she said. "If I had known what you'd been through, I would have spoken up sooner. You're a hero, and you should have been treated like one." Sarah shook her head gently. "I didn't serve for recognition," she replied. "I served because it was the right thing to do. The men and women I served with were the real heroes. I just did my job." Commander Mitchell smiled at her response. "That's exactly what a real hero would say," he observed. "False heroes brag about their service. Real heroes like you just quietly go about their lives, carrying the weight of their experiences and the memory of their fallen friends." He turned to address the entire diner. "This woman sitting here has seen and done things that would break most of us. She's watched friends die, held dying soldiers in her arms, and somehow found the strength to keep going and keep saving lives. Her tattoos aren't decorations or fashion statements. They're memorials, honors, and reminders of the most important work anyone can do." Robert Henderson, who had remained mostly silent during his wife's outburst, stood up from his table and walked over to Sarah. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "I want to apologize for my wife's behavior and for not speaking up sooner. Thank you for your service, and thank you for the sacrifices you made for all of us." Other customers began to approach Sarah as well, offering apologies and expressions of gratitude. An elderly man who had been sitting alone introduced himself as a Vietnam veteran and shook Sarah's hand firmly. A young mother with 2 small children explained to her kids that Sarah was a real-life hero who had protected other soldiers in the war. Mrs. Henderson remained standing near the counter, looking increasingly isolated as the community she thought would support her turned away. She had misjudged not only Sarah but also the character of her neighbors. The people of Millfield were good-hearted folks who supported their veterans and appreciated sacrifice. They had only needed someone to help them understand the truth. Commander Mitchell sat down across from Sarah in her booth, and Martha immediately brought him a cup of coffee without being asked. "I hope you don't mind if I join you for breakfast," he said. "I'd like to hear about your service, if you're comfortable sharing." Sarah nodded, grateful for the company and the understanding. "I'd like that, sir. It's been a long time since I talked to someone who understood what those years were like." As they began to talk, the atmosphere in the diner slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed, though they were quieter and more respectful than before. People continued to glance over at Sarah's table, but now their looks carried admiration and curiosity rather than judgment and fear. Mrs. Henderson gathered her purse and prepared to leave, realizing that staying would only make her humiliation worse. As she walked toward the door, she stopped briefly at Sarah's table. "I owe you an apology," she said stiffly. "I was wrong to judge you based on your appearance. I'm sorry for the things I said." Sarah looked up at her with kind eyes. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "We all make mistakes when we don't understand something. The important thing is that we learn from them." Mrs. Henderson nodded and walked out of the diner, leaving behind a community that had learned an important lesson about assumptions, respect, and the true meaning of honor. The breakfast rush continued, but something had changed in Murphy's diner. People were more thoughtful, more aware of their own prejudices, and more grateful for the sacrifices made by those who had served their country. Commander Mitchell and Sarah spent the next hour sharing stories about their military experiences. He told her about recent changes in SEAL training and operations, while she described the challenges of being a female medic in male-dominated combat units. Their conversation drew interested listeners from nearby tables, all eager to learn more about military service and the experiences of those who had volunteered to defend their freedom. By the time breakfast was over, Sarah had gone from being an outcast to being the most respected person in the restaurant. Commander Mitchell left his business card and invited her to attend a veterans gathering the following month. Other customers exchanged contact information with her, inviting her to community events and expressing genuine interest in her well-being. As Sarah prepared to leave, Tom Murphy approached her table one more time. "Sarah," he said, "I want you to know that you're always welcome here. In fact, I'd be honored if you'd consider letting me put up a small plaque recognizing your service. We've never had a decorated combat veteran as a regular customer before." Sarah smiled, touched by the gesture, but preferring to maintain her privacy. "That's very kind, Tom, but not necessary. I appreciate the thought, though." She gathered her belongings and headed toward the door, aware that many eyes were still following her movements. But now those eyes held respect and admiration instead of suspicion and fear. The bell chimed as she pushed through the door, and she could hear conversations resuming behind her, no doubt continuing to discuss what they had learned that morning. 3 weeks later, Sarah walked into Murphy's diner and immediately noticed how different the atmosphere had become. Where once she had faced suspicious stares and whispered comments, she now received warm smiles and friendly greetings from customers she barely knew. The transformation was remarkable, but it also brought its own set of challenges that Sarah hadn't anticipated. "Good morning, Sarah," called out Betty Morrison, an elderly woman who had witnessed the confrontation with Mrs. Henderson. Betty waved enthusiastically from her corner booth, where she sat with 3 other women from her book club. "Would you like to join us? We're discussing a wonderful novel about World War II, and we'd love to hear your perspective on military life." Sarah appreciated the kind invitation, but politely declined, preferring to maintain her routine of sitting alone in her usual booth. She had always used her breakfast time for quiet reflection, reading, or simply organizing her thoughts for the day ahead. The newfound attention, while well-intentioned, sometimes felt overwhelming. Martha approached her table with a steaming pot of coffee and a knowing smile. Over the past 3 weeks, she had watched Sarah navigate her new status as the diner's most respected customer. "The usual?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Please," Sarah replied, settling into her familiar seat. Through the window beside her booth, she could see the town beginning to wake up. Early morning joggers passed by on the sidewalk, and business owners were unlocking their shops and preparing for another day. Millfield was starting to feel like home in a way that no place had since she left the military. As Martha poured her coffee, Sarah noticed a young woman sitting alone at a table near the front of the restaurant. The woman appeared to be in her mid-20s, with short brown hair and nervous eyes that darted around the room. She wore an oversized hoodie despite the warm autumn weather, and she kept checking her phone as if expecting an important call. What caught Sarah's attention wasn't the woman's appearance, but her behavior. She recognized the signs from her own experience and from countless soldiers she had treated during her tours of duty. The way the woman sat with her back to the wall, how she flinched slightly when the door chimed, and the careful way she surveyed everyone who entered the restaurant all suggested someone dealing with hypervigilance and anxiety. "Do you know that young woman over there?" Sarah asked Martha quietly, nodding toward the front table. Martha glanced over discreetly. "That's Jessica Chun. She moved to town about a week ago and has been coming in every morning since then. Always sits alone, hardly talks to anyone. She seems nice enough, but she's clearly going through something difficult." "Why do you ask?" Before Sarah could respond, the diner's bell chimed and 3 men walked in together. They were dressed in construction clothes and work boots, clearly laborers heading to a job site after breakfast. Their conversation was loud and boisterous, and they seemed to be in good spirits despite the early hour. Sarah watched as Jessica's reaction to their entrance confirmed her suspicions. The young woman tensed visibly, her hand moving instinctively to her purse, and she shifted in her seat to keep the men in her line of sight. These weren't the actions of someone who was simply shy or introverted. This was someone who had learned to be constantly alert for potential threats. The 3 workers took a table in the center of the restaurant and began discussing their plans for the day. Their conversation was harmless enough, focusing on a house renovation project they were working on, but their voices carried easily across the quiet diner. Jessica appeared to relax slightly as she realized they posed no immediate threat, but Sarah could see that the young woman remained on edge. Tom Murphy emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh pastries for the display case. He had been making an effort to personally greet Sarah every morning since the incident with Mrs. Henderson, a gesture of respect that she appreciated even though it sometimes drew unwanted attention. "Morning, Sarah," he said warmly as he passed her table. "Beautiful day shaping up outside. Any plans for later?" "Just the usual," Sarah replied. "Might take a walk around the town square this afternoon if the weather holds up." Their brief exchange was interrupted by a commotion at Jessica's table. The young woman had accidentally knocked over her water glass while reaching for her purse, and water was spreading across the table and dripping onto the floor. She looked mortified by the accident and immediately began apologizing profusely while trying to clean up the mess with paper napkins. "It's okay, honey. Accidents happen," Martha called out as she hurried over with a dishcloth. But Jessica's reaction seemed disproportionate to the minor mishap. Her hands were shaking as she gathered her things, and she appeared to be on the verge of tears. Sarah recognized the signs of someone whose nervous system was operating in constant crisis mode. Small setbacks that others might shrug off could feel overwhelming when you were already struggling with trauma and hypervigilance. Without thinking too much about it, she stood up and walked over to Jessica's table. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked gently, kneeling down to help collect the scattered napkins. Jessica looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to make a mess. I'm usually not this clumsy. I haven't been sleeping well, and my hands have been shaky lately." "There's nothing to apologize for," Sarah said calmly. "We've all been there. Would you like to sit with me? I have a table in the back that's usually quieter." For a moment, Jessica hesitated, clearly torn between her desire for solitude and her need for human connection. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. Finally, Jessica nodded and gathered her belongings. They moved to Sarah's booth in the back corner, where the young woman immediately seemed to relax. The position offered a clear view of the entire restaurant while providing a sense of security and privacy. Sarah ordered another coffee for Jessica and waited patiently for her to feel comfortable enough to talk. "I'm Sarah," she said simply, not wanting to overwhelm her new companion with too much information. "Jessica," came the quiet reply. "I just moved here from Seattle. Starting over, I guess." Sarah nodded understandingly. She had started over many times herself in different towns and different circumstances. Sometimes a fresh beginning was exactly what someone needed to heal from past trauma. "How are you finding Millfield so far?" Sarah asked. Jessica managed a small smile. "It's peaceful, quiet, very different from the city. I needed somewhere different, somewhere I could think clearly again." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the morning customers come and go. The three construction workers finished their breakfast and left for their job site, their voices fading as they walked out to their truck. The book club ladies continued their animated discussion of literature and life. The normal rhythm of small-town morning life continued around them. "Can I ask you something?" Jessica said suddenly. "That woman at the next table over there mentioned that you were in the military. Is that true?" Sarah glanced over and saw Betty Morrison gesturing enthusiastically while telling her friend some story. Word of Sarah's background had spread quickly through the small community, as news always did in places like Millfield. "I was," Sarah confirmed. "Army medic. 3 tours in Afghanistan." Jessica's expression changed, becoming more focused and serious. Did you ever have trouble adjusting when you came back? Feeling like you couldn't trust people, or like danger was everywhere even when it wasn't?" The question revealed more about Jessica's situation than any direct explanation could have. Sarah recognized the careful way she had phrased it, testing to see if Sarah would understand her experience without having to explicitly describe her own trauma. "Every day for a long time," Sarah replied honestly. "It takes time to teach your brain that it's safe to relax again. Some days are better than others, even now." Jessica's eyes filled with tears of relief. "Everyone keeps telling me I should just move on and stop being so paranoid. They say I'm overreacting to everything, that I need to trust people more. But it's not that simple." "No, it's not," Sarah agreed. "And anyone who says it has never had their sense of safety completely shattered. Healing from trauma isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it doesn't affect you. It's about learning to feel safe again, one small step at a time." Over the next hour, Jessica gradually opened up about her situation. She had been in an abusive relationship in Seattle, one that had escalated to the point where she feared for her life. The final incident had resulted in her ex-boyfriend's arrest, but he had been released on bail and had made threats to find her wherever she went. She had changed her name, moved across the country, and was trying to build a new life while constantly looking over her shoulder. Sarah listened without judgment, offering support and understanding rather than advice. She had seen too many trauma survivors who had been told what they should do or how they should feel by people who had never experienced anything similar. Sometimes the most healing thing was simply being heard and believed. "Have you been able to connect with any support services here?" Sarah asked. Jessica shook her head. "I don't know what's available in a town this size. In Seattle, there are support groups and counselors who specialize in domestic violence, but I haven't found anything like that here yet." "I might be able to help with that," Sarah offered. "I've been working with a local Veterans Services coordinator, and she's connected to a lot of other support networks in the area. Would you like me to make some inquiries?" For the first time since Sarah had approached her table, Jessica smiled genuinely. "That would be amazing. I've been trying to handle everything on my own, but it's been harder than I expected." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Mitchell, who had returned to the diner for the first time since the morning he had defended Sarah. He spotted her in the back booth and made his way over, his presence commanding the same respectful attention it had during his previous visit. "Good morning, Sarah," he said warmly. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Sarah introduced Jessica to the commander, explaining that she was new to town and looking to get connected with local support services. Commander Mitchell's expression grew serious as he picked up on the underlying implications of their conversation. Actually, he said, you might be interested to know that we're starting a new support group next month. It's for anyone dealing with trauma, not just veterans. The idea is to create a safe space where people can share their experiences and support each other's healing journey. Jessica's eyes lit up with interest. Really? That sounds exactly like what I need. Commander Mitchell pulled out his phone and showed her the contact information for Dr. Sarah Williams, a trauma counselor who had recently moved to the area specifically to work with underserved populations in rural communities. Dr. Williams is a specialist in PTSD and complex trauma, he explained. She's been working with me to develop programming that addresses the unique challenges faced by trauma survivors in small towns, where resources are limited and privacy can be difficult to maintain. Sarah was impressed by the commander's understanding and commitment to helping trauma survivors beyond just military veterans. It spoke to the kind of leader he was and the values that guided his actions. As they discussed the details of the upcoming support group, other customers in the diner began to take notice. Several people approached their table to express interest in the program, including Robert Henderson, who quietly mentioned that his nephew was struggling with trauma from a car accident and might benefit from such a group. What had started as a chance encounter between two trauma survivors was developing into something much larger. Word the support group spread through the diner and, by extension, through the wider community. By the end of breakfast, Commander Mitchell had collected contact information from 8 people who wanted to participate or knew someone who might benefit from the program. This is exactly what this community needed, Tom Murphy observed as he stopped by their table. We've got good people here, but not everyone knows how to help when someone's going through a difficult time. Having a structured program with professional support could make a real difference. As the breakfast crowd began to thin out, Jessica expressed her gratitude to both Sarah and Commander Mitchell for their kindness and support. For the first time since arriving in Millfield, she felt like she might be able to build genuine connections and find the help she needed to heal. Thank you for approaching me this morning, she told Sarah. I've been eating alone every day since I got here, too scared to talk to anyone. I never imagined I'd find someone who understood what I was going through. Sarah smiled warmly. That's what community is supposed to be about. We take care of each other, especially when someone's going through a hard time. You're not alone anymore. As they prepared to leave the diner, Commander Mitchell made a suggestion that surprised them both. Sarah, would you consider co-facilitating this support group with Dr. Williams? Your experience as both a combat veteran and someone who's successfully transitioned to civilian life would be invaluable. And your natural empathy and understanding would help create the kind of safe environment that trauma survivors need. Sarah was taken aback by the suggestion. She had never considered herself qualified to help lead a formal support program, but she could see the wisdom in Commander Mitchell's proposal. Her own healing journey had been long and difficult, but she had learned valuable lessons that might help others navigating similar challenges. I need to think about it, she said carefully, and I want to meet with Dr. Williams first to understand what would be expected. Of course, Commander Mitchell replied, but I think you'd be surprised by how much you have to offer. Sometimes the best healers are those who've walked the same path. Jessica nodded enthusiastically. Sarah, you've helped me more in one morning than I've been helped in months. If you decide to co-facilitate the group, I know it will be exactly what people need. As they walked out of Murphy's diner together, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning 3 weeks ago when she had been ridiculed and judged by people who didn't understand her story. Not only had she found acceptance and respect in the community, but she was now being asked to use her experiences to help others heal from their own trauma. The small town that had initially seemed unwelcoming was revealing itself to be a place where real healing and community support were possible. Sarah realized that her decision to stay in Millfield and make it her home had been the right one, not just for her own well-being, but for the contribution she could make to others who were struggling. That afternoon, as she took her usual walk around the town square, Sarah made her decision. She would meet with Dr. Williams and explore the possibility of co-facilitating the support group. Her tattoos would no longer be sources of judgment and misunderstanding, but symbols of survival, service, and the strength to help others find their own path to healing. The ridicule she had faced at breakfast that morning 3 weeks ago had led to unexpected opportunities to serve her community in a new way. Sometimes, Sarah thought, the most painful experiences can become the foundation for the most meaningful work. She was ready to turn her scars into sources of strength for others who were still learning to heal.